Inside the steel gut of the Atlantic, 30 men breathe the same recycled air. Their eyes glisten in the dim red glow of a single emergency lamp, skin glistening with the damp sheen of metal sweat. Every creak of the hull sounds like a death sentence. The pressure outside could crush a man into paste in less than a heartbeat. Yet inside this narrow oil-slick corridor someone laughs, quietly, almost madly, as a piece of moldy bread swings from a rusted pipe by a string of wire. It's dinner. They call it bread hanging from pipes. The laughter dies quickly. The man who tied it there, Obersteuermann Fritz Hagen, hasn't spoken since morning. His fingers shake as he tears a piece off and hands it down the line. 1 bite per man. They chew in silence, listening to the ocean clawing above them. The bread tastes of oil and iron. The commander, Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, stands in the control room, back straight, eyes on the depth gauge. His jaw tightens. The destroyers are still hunting them. Hours have stretched into eternity. Somewhere above, the British frigates crisscross the waves, listening. The U-boat is wounded, leaking air. Its batteries almost dead. And so in the black belly of the Atlantic, where men live half dead between breath and explosion, they wait, eating bread that hangs from pipes. The year was 1941. The Atlantic was a graveyard. Each convoy that dared to cross its gray expanse knew death waited below. U-boat 96, commissioned from the shipyards at Kiel, slipped from the harbor at dawn, its sleek steel skin shining with frost. Crew lined along the deck like ghosts in wool caps. They waved to no one. There was no band, no farewell ceremony. The sea swallowed their silhouettes before the sun could rise high enough to remember them. Inside, the air already carried the sharp scent of diesel, sweat, and machine oil. The corridors were narrow enough that 2 men passing each other had to twist sideways. Every surface dripped with condensation. Hammocks were slung above torpedoes. Bunks were shared in shifts. Fresh bread hung from the overhead piping to keep it dry from the ever-present damp, swaying gently with the motion of the waves. Among the new recruits was Matrosengefreiter Karl Metz, 20 years old, from a quiet village near Bremen. He'd never seen the ocean until his assignment. His hands were soft, his voice shy. When the hatch sealed behind him, he had no idea that the world he knew had just ceased to exist. "Welcome to the coffin," an older sailor grinned, slapping his shoulder. "Don't worry. After a week you stop smelling the air." Metz laughed nervously. But by the second day, he stopped laughing. The boat dove for the first time beyond periscope depth. The pressure sang through the hull, an eerie, groaning chorus. Every bolt seemed to tighten, every joint to protest. The veteran sailors smiled faintly at the sound. It was the sound of the ocean accepting them. For Metz, it was the sound of something immense pressing its hand on his chest. Water condensed into rivulets that ran down the walls. Men wiped them away with rags that never dried. They worked by the faint yellow glow of electric bulbs, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. The engines throbbed like a heartbeat. At 60 meters, the commander's voice broke the silence. "Maintain depth." All stopped, the engines died. The stillness was unbearable. It was in that silence that Metz first understood why old sailors whispered that submarines had souls and moods. When the boat was quiet, it felt alive, listening. Days passed in monotony punctured by terror. Each morning began with stale coffee brewed from reused grounds. Men shaved with seawater and brushed their teeth with salt and oil. When the commander ordered periscope depth, sunlight would slice through the scope, scattering across the metal interior like a brief reminder of the world above. Then came orders: surface to recharge batteries, open the hatch for fresh air, man the deck gun if needed. The air outside was cold and brutal, but it tasted like freedom. At night, the sea was endless and black, flecked with phosphorescent foam that glowed in the wake. The crew would stand watch under the stars, muffled in wool and fear, while the diesels roared. Below deck, the rest slept in the constant vibration, bodies pressed together like books on a shelf. Metz couldn't sleep. He'd stare at the pipe above his head, the one where the bread hung, slowly molding. It swung gently as though breathing with the boat. One night he asked Obermaschinist Franz Richter why they kept it there. The older man smiled without mirth. "Keeps it dry. Down here, dry is worth more than gold." By the end of the first patrol week, Metz no longer noticed the smell of oil or the sour sweat of 30 men. The submarine became his world. Steel walls, red lights, and the rhythm of air compressors. The ocean outside was no longer terrifying. It was an unending presence, sometimes calm, sometimes murderous. Their first target appeared on the 8th night. A British freighter, part of convoy HX-1 and 12, steaming alone under low clouds. Surface at dusk. Lehman Willenbrock ordered. Prepare tubes 1 through 4. Men scrambled, faces taut. Every order was spoken softly, absorbed by the steel. Metz watched from the control room, heart pounding. Through the periscope, the freighter loomed, a black silhouette moving steady across gray water. Torpedo. Loss! The boat trembled as the first torpedo launched, then another. A minute later, a dull thunder rolled through the ocean. Flames erupted across the freighter's hull. Men screamed across the water, voices echoing like ghosts through fog. Metz pressed his palms over his ears. He could still hear them. Direct hit, said the first officer flatly. Target sinking. Good, Lehman Willenbrock muttered. We disappear now. They dove silent. For the first time, Metz understood the strange mixture of pride and horror that haunted U-boat men. Above, men drowned. Below, men cheered quietly, then went back to eating their rationed bread. The next week blurred into sleepless repetition, attacks, dives, long hours of waiting as depth charges rained from above. The sea shook with explosions. Inside the boat, light fixtures rattled, dust drifted from seams, and prayers whispered in every accent of Germany. After one particularly violent barrage, the crew found themselves trapped at 120 meters. Water seeped through a hairline crack near the aft compartment. Pumps screamed to keep up. The commander's voice was calm but cold. No noise. They're listening. So they waited. 2 hours. 3. The air grew thick. Sweat rolled down faces. Someone fainted. The cook passed along pieces of the hanging bread, hard as rock, half-molded, but something to chew to keep from losing their minds. Metz bit into his and tasted iron, salt, and rust. It felt alive in his mouth, the taste of survival and decay. When the destroyers finally moved on, no one cheered. They simply sat in silence, hearing the dripping water, smelling the stale air, knowing it would happen again tomorrow. This was U-boat life. Days of monotony, seconds of terror, and endless hunger for food, for sleep, for air. After 20 days at sea, they surfaced under the cover of night to receive fresh orders via radio from BDU, U-boat command. The signal was faint, pulsing through static. Proceed to AM-52 quadrant. Convoy sighted. The commander stood under the open hatch, night wind hitting his face. The stars glimmered on the black horizon. He closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps remembering land or the faces of those who would never see him again. Below, men swapped filters in the air system and drained bilge water by hand. Metz worked with the others, fingers numb from cold and vibration. His mind drifted between exhaustion and dreams of his mother's kitchen, of bread warm from the oven, not hanging, not moldy, not swinging from a pipe like bait. When he woke the next morning, the sea was calm. A thin mist lay across the surface. The commander's voice cut through it. Convoy ahead. Prepare for attack. And once again the steel tomb came alive. The attack began before dawn. The sea was glassy, the horizon bruised with faint light, and the periscope lens glimmered with dew. U-96 floated at periscope depth, diesel engines dead, electric motors whispering. Inside, men spoke in whispers, as though the enemy could hear their thoughts through the hull. Convoy sighted. Bearing 095. Lehman Willenbrock's voice was calm, but his eyes carried that feverish intensity that came only before the strike. Through the periscope he could see them. A phalanx of merchant ships, gray hulks crawling east under a low ceiling of mist. Destroyers weaved along the flanks, listening, hunting. Set depth 40 meters. Prepare tubes 1 through 4. The orders rippled through the boat like electric current. The torpedo crew slid across the slick metal floor, bodies moving with machine precision. The air reeked of grease and adrenaline. Every sound was muffled. Even the clang of tools seemed swallowed by the walls. Metz crouched by the bulkhead, helping pass tools, his hands shaking despite the cold. His breath came shallow. He could hear his own pulse in his ears. Above him, condensation gathered and fell in slow, rhythmic drops, tapping the deck like a metronome marking time to death. Then came the low moan of the commander's voice. Fire 1. The boat lurched. Fire 2. A second shudder. Moments later, the sound. A thunderclap through the ocean. Then another. The hull vibrated as shock waves rolled past. Somewhere above, fire bloomed across the surface of the Atlantic. 2 hits confirmed, murmured the first officer. Through the periscope, Lehman Willenbrock watched as a freighter split in half, its cargo spilling flaming oil into the sea. Lifeboats overturned in the inferno. Men leaped into the water, tiny dark shapes flailing in firelight. He lowered the scope slowly, jaw tight. "We dive." The engines hummed low as the U-boat sank beneath the wreckage. At 70 meters, the sea pressed in like a fist. The crew's faces were gray with fatigue, eyes fixed on the depth gauge as the needle quivered. Then came the first sonar ping. It was soft, distant, a chime echoing through the steel like a bell in a tomb. Then another closer. The destroyers had found them. "Silent running," the commander ordered. Every fan, every whisper, every breath slowed. Men froze in position. The engines fell silent. Only the creak of the hull and the faint hiss of air compressors filled the dark. Metz sat wedged beside the bulkhead, holding a wrench tight in his fist. His mind swirled with memories of home. His mother's hands kneading dough, the smell of rain on fields. He bit his lip until he tasted blood, trying not to tremble. Above them, the destroyer circled. The sonar pings came faster, sharper. Then tuned the deep whine of screws turning hard to port. The enemy was closing. "Brace," whispered the commander. The first depth charge exploded close enough to lift the boat off her bearings. Dust and rust flakes rained from the ceiling. Lights flickered. Someone screamed as a valve burst, spraying boiling water. The pressure gauges spun wildly. "Hold it together!" Richter bellowed from the engine room. But the second explosion came closer. A blinding flash of sparks erupted from an electrical panel. Men ducked instinctively. The hull groaned like a living thing in pain, and then silence again. The destroyer moved off, circling. The boat drifted, wounded. Condensation ran down the walls like sweat. The smell of burned insulation filled the air. "Report," Lehman Willenbrock demanded. "Minor flooding in aft compartment. Batteries holding. Depth 110 meters. He nodded once. "We wait." For 6 hours they remained entombed in darkness. The air grew foul. Men took turns near the last working ventilation pipe, breathing in slow, shallow drafts. Metz's head throbbed from lack of oxygen. Somewhere water dripped in a slow, maddening rhythm, and then a sound no one expected. A voice. It came faintly, as if the sea itself were speaking, muffled, distorted. A human voice vibrating through the hull. The crew froze. Even the commander turned his head, eyes narrowing. "Is that singing?" whispered one of the mechanics. They pressed their ears to the cold steel. The sound was unmistakable. A sailor's voice somewhere outside, singing in English. A lifeboat, perhaps, or a man clinging to wreckage drifting above their position. The song was thin, carried through the water like a ghost's lament. "Oh, Danny boy, the pipes. The pipes are calling." The men listened, transfixed. Some crossed themselves. Others turned away, faces pale. The ocean carried not only their enemies' machines, but their dead. Lehman Willenbrock finally broke the silence. "That's enough. Back to stations." His voice trembled for the first time. By the time they surfaced that night, the sky was clear and black. Stars spilled across the heavens, mirrored by the phosphorescence on the water. The commander stood on the bridge, cold wind tearing at his coat. The sea was empty. No survivors, no ships, only oil slicks glowing faintly under moonlight. Metz climbed up behind him for his first watch. He had not spoken for hours. The commander handed him binoculars. "Keep your eyes open," he said. The Atlantic forgets no one. They scanned the horizon together. In the distance, a faint orange glow marked the death of another ship. The air smelled of oil and burned paint. Somewhere, waves slapped against floating debris. Metz swallowed. "Herr Kalu, that song. Was it real?" Lehman Willenbrock didn't answer immediately. His face was unreadable. "In this sea," he finally said, "everything you hear is real. Until you go mad." They watched in silence as dawn broke. A thin gray line across an endless black world. Life aboard resumed its brutal rhythm. Repairs were made, leaks sealed with rubber patches and bolts. The crew worked shirtless in the humid heat, skin slick with sweat, hands raw from salt. They ate cold tinned meat and chewed dry bread that had long gone hard. The hanging loaves had shrunk to brittle husks, but the men kept them like relics, reminders of the first days when hope still tasted fresh. One night, while the boat cruised submerged at periscope depth, Metz was on galley duty. The cook, a cheerful Berliner named Kappel, hummed as he stirred a pot of barley soup made from leftover rations and canned vegetables. "Don't worry, boy," he grinned. "Tonight you'll eat like an admiral." Metz smiled faintly, though the soup smelled of rust and despair. He ladled portions into metal bowls, passing them down the narrow corridor. The men accepted in silence, eating standing, bowls balanced on knees. Then came the sudden call from the control room. "Aircraft spotted. Crash dive." The bowls clattered to the floor as the alarm blared. Kappel cursed as boiling soup splashed his arm. The men scrambled for their stations. Valves spun, vents sealed, the hum of the motors deepened. The U-boat plunged like a stone. Metz barely made it through the hatch before the deck tilted sharply. Water sloshed around his boots. He grabbed a pipe for balance, the same one from which the bread still hung, now reduced to a gray lump swinging wildly. The sound of bombs followed, muffled, distant thuds, then sharper blasts. The lights flickered out. In the pitch dark, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else laughed, hysterical. The ocean howled around them. When the attack ended, the silence was total. The only sound was the steady drip of condensation. Kappel broke it with a shaky laugh. "Dinner's ruined again," the men chuckled, weakly, but it was laughter nonetheless. In that laughter there was something defiant, something unkillable. Days turned to weeks. The crew's beards grew long, their eyes hollow. Letters from home, sealed in oilskin, were read and reread until the paper tore. One man, radio operator Johann Kruger, received a message that his wife had given birth. He smiled for an hour straight, then cried silently into his hands. The commander said nothing, but after that night, Kruger was always assigned near the radio, as if Lehman Willenbrock wanted him close, to the only voice that could still reach him. But the voices, through the hull, returned. It began one night during a silent run near the Bay of Biscay. The crew was asleep, the air thick with carbon dioxide, when Metz woke suddenly. He thought he heard tapping, faint, rhythmic. At first he assumed it was pipes expanding with temperature, but then he realized the pattern repeated. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short SOS. He sat up, heart pounding. The sound came from the outer hull, impossible yet real. He woke Richter, who pressed his ear to the wall. The old machinist frowned. "Impossible," he whispered. "No one's out there." But the tapping continued. By the time the commander arrived, half the crew was awake, listening. The pattern repeated 3 times, then silence. Lehman Willenbrock's face was pale. He finally said, "Depth 120 meters. No survivors would be alive at this depth." No one spoke. The commander ordered engines to full ahead, as though distance could erase the sound. Metz lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling pipes, listening for any sign. When none came, he began to wonder if the sea was simply echoing their own despair back at them. By the 5th week, U-96's supplies were nearly gone. The air was thick with mold and fuel vapors. Men slept in their sweat. The bread that hung from the pipes had turned black with fungus. Still, no one threw it away. It had become a symbol of endurance, of madness, of the line between living and surviving. One morning, the commander gathered the crew in the control room. His voice was soft, almost fatherly. "We're heading home. Kiel is calling us back." Cheers broke out, weak but real. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. Metz laughed, leaning against the cold steel, imagining sunlight, clean air, the sound of seagulls. But fate was cruel. That night, as they crossed into the Bay of Biscay, radar contact appeared. British aircraft hunting in the dark. "Dive. Dive, dive." The boat plunged again into blackness. Engines roared, ballast tanks filled. But it was too late. Depth charges blossomed above them like underwater thunder. The shockwave slammed the hull. Metal screamed. Valves burst. A flood of seawater tore through the aft compartment. Lights died. Men shouted, scrambling to close hatches. Metz slipped, crashing into the deck. Salt water surged around his legs. The emergency lighting flicked on, dim red, bathing everything in blood. "Damage report," the commander shouted. "Flooding controlled, but we're heavy aft." Lehman Willenbrock's face was pale but resolute. "Pump out ballast. Maintain depth 90 meters. The crew obeyed, hands shaking. The pumps groaned. Slowly, agonizingly, the boat leveled out. When the last pump stopped, a weary silence filled the air. The commander leaned against the bulkhead, exhaling smoke from a cigarette. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we live another day." Metz looked up at the ceiling. The bread still hung there, black, twisted, dripping with condensation. For a moment he swore he saw it move, as though breathing. He closed his eyes. In that endless night beneath the sea, surrounded by steel oil and ghosts, he no longer knew whether they were still men, or part of the machine that kept them alive. The Atlantic in autumn was not water, but memory. Cold, heavy, and endless. For those trapped beneath its surface, it smelled of death long before death arrived. Inside U-96, the air no longer resembled air at all. It was a stew of sweat, oil, mildew, and fear. Every breath carried the ghost of 30 lungs exhaling the same carbon dioxide into the same recycled eternity. By now, the men had been at sea for 56 days. Every surface was damp, slick with condensation that rained from pipes like a constant drizzle. Salt crusted the seams of the walls. The bread that once hung like hope had turned black, dusted with mold the color of ash. No one spoke of eating it anymore, but still no one took it down. It had become part of the boat, part of their endurance, or perhaps their curse. Metz had grown thin, eyes sunken, his uniform stiff with salt. He moved mechanically, one motion to the next, as though he had been absorbed by the steel around him. In sleep he dreamed of open fields, but the sound that woke him each time was always the same: dripping water. The commander, Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, spent long hours in silence. He smoked constantly, the red glow of his cigarette the only ember in the dark. His face had lost its sharp edges. He looked carved from pale stone. The responsibility of 30 souls weighed heavier than the sea above. That morning, the radio operator Kruger turned from his console, pale. "Herr Kahlo, BDU reports heavy enemy air patrols near Biscay. We are advised to hold position until further orders." Lehmann Willenbrock nodded, eyes on the chart. "How long can we last here?" 2 days, maybe 3. After that, food and air become a problem." He exhaled smoke. "Then we wait too." The men groaned quietly, not in defiance, but fatigue. Waiting was their truest enemy. Waiting for orders, for silence, for death. The smell grew worse each hour. It came first from the aft compartment, faint at first like rotting leather. Then stronger, thicker, the heat from the batteries mixed with humidity and human stench, turning the boat into a living swamp. Someone vomited. Richter, the chief engineer, muttered as he tightened a valve. "It's the bilge water. Dead fish in the intake, maybe." But by the second day, everyone knew it wasn't fish. "Rats," whispered Kappel, the cook. "They came aboard with the bread. Now they're dying somewhere in the bilge." The commander gave no order to find them. It would mean crawling into the narrow crawl space beneath the aft torpedo room. Among pipes slick with diesel and slime, the smell became another presence, one that followed them wherever they went. The smell of the Dead Sea inside their steel coffin. On the 61st day, the first man collapsed. It was Seaman Otto Weiss, a torpedo loader with eyes like glass. He fell mid-shift, striking his head against a pipe. The medic rushed to him, slapping his face, checking his pulse. "Exhaustion," he said quietly. "No food left. He hasn't eaten in 2 days." "Get him water," the commander ordered, but there was little of that too. They laid Weiss in his bunk, his lips cracked, breath shallow. The medic whispered something about his heart. Hours later, he stopped breathing. No one spoke. The commander stood at the foot of the bunk, cap in hand. "He'll have his sea burial when we surface," he said softly. But they didn't surface that day or the next. The storm above was too violent and the destroyers still prowled. So Weiss stayed among them, a shrouded shape tied in canvas resting beside the torpedo tubes, as though waiting to be fired into eternity. The smell grew thicker. On the 63rd day, Lehmann Willenbrock finally ordered a night surfacing. "We need air," he said. "Whatever's above, we take the risk." The men obeyed eagerly. When the hatch opened, a blast of freezing air hit their faces. They climbed onto the bridge like prisoners tasting freedom. Rain whipped across their cheeks. Salt burned their eyes, but they laughed, weakly, hysterically wrong at the sensation of open wind. Below deck, fans roared, sucking in cold oxygen and spitting out the poison they'd been breathing for days. Metz leaned against the bulkhead, eyes closed, inhaling deeply. It was almost painful, like life returning to dead lungs. Then the alarm came. Radar contact. Aircraft inbound. The commander's voice cut through the chaos. Crash dive. Men dove through the hatch, sealing it behind them as water sprayed the deck. The engines screamed. The boat plunged. Seconds later, machine gun fire stitched the sea above, followed by the deep concussions of bombs. The lights flickered, but the hull held. When silence returned, they were at 80 meters. No damage on this time. Lehman Willenbrock stood in the control room, face calm, voice steady. Resume course south. Metz looked up at him in disbelief. South, Herr Callot. Toward Biscay? Toward home, he said. Or what's left of it. That night the bread fell. It had hung for 2 months, its wire rusted to near breaking. As the boat rolled in a deep swell, the wire snapped. The blackened loaf dropped to the deck with a wet thud. Every man turned instinctively toward the sound. Capel, ever the joker, whispered, Looks like it finally surrendered. No one laughed. Lehman Willenbrock stared at it for a long time. Then he said quietly, Throw it overboard when we surface. It served its purpose, but they never did. Someone, Metz thought it was Richter, picked it up, placed it back on the pipe, and tied it again with new wire. A silent ritual, a superstition. As long as the bread remained, perhaps so would they. 2 days later, they encountered wreckage. At periscope depth, Lehman Willenbrock scanned the horizon and saw floating debris, splintered wood, life jackets, oil slicks. No survivors, a merchant ship, likely sunk by another U-boat. But amid the wreckage, something caught his eye, a body. It drifted face down, uniform tattered. British by the look of it. Around its wrist gleamed a silver watch. The commander lowered the periscope, expression unreadable. Surface. Recover that man. The crew obeyed silently. The hatch opened. Men clambered onto the deck, waves slapping their boots. 2 sailors hauled the body aboard, laying it gently on the steel. The smell hit them instantly, the sweet, nauseating odor of rot and salt. The man's face was gray, eyes open, staring at nothing. Capel crossed himself. Why bring him aboard, Herr Callot? Lehman Willenbrock knelt beside the corpse. Because even the enemy deserves not to be left to the fish. They wrapped the man in canvas, secured him with a weight. Before sliding him back into the sea, the commander removed the watch. We'll send it to BDU. Maybe someone will know his name. As the body vanished beneath the waves, Metz felt a strange peace. For a brief moment death had form, not just sound or smell or fear, but a face. But the sea was not finished. That night, as U-96 cruised submerged at 40 meters, the hydrophone operator stiffened. Herr Callot, multiple screws, fast approach, destroyers? Yes, sir. At least 2, silent running. All hands, the engine stopped. The lights dimmed. The men froze. Pings echoed through the hull, faster, louder. The first explosion came seconds later, directly above. The hull flexed violently, throwing men from their bunks. A pipe burst in the forward compartment, spraying steam. Water cascaded down the walls, depth 100, shouted Richter. Hold her steady. Lehman Willenbrock barked. A second explosion struck closer. A wrench flew from someone's hand. The hull groaned like a beast. For a moment, Metz thought the steel would tear open and the Atlantic would rush in to claim them all. But it didn't. When the last charge detonated, the sea went still. Only the sound of creaking metal remained. We're alive, whispered someone. Lehman Willenbrock nodded. Barely. After that night, no one slept. The air was so foul that candles burned blue. The men's skin broke into rashes. Breathing felt like swallowing seawater. The commander finally gave the order. We surface at dawn. Whatever happens, we breathe. At sunrise, they broke through the waves. The sky was pale gold, the sea calm. The men climbed onto the deck in silence, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. Some wept openly at the sight of light. Metz leaned on the railing, inhaling the cold morning air. It smelled of salt and oil, and freedom. Capel emerged with a small bundle. Weiss, he said softly. It's time. They gathered around the wrapped body. The commander read the words of the sea burial service, voice low but steady. May God receive his soul and may the sea guard his body. 2 men lifted the canvas. Weiss slid gently into the water, vanishing without a ripple. Silence followed, heavy, reverent. The commander saluted. The men followed. For a moment, even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The return to base was long and perilous. Storms battered them, and fuel ran dangerously low. Every hour someone asked how much farther. Every answer was the same. Far enough. On the 68th day, the lookout spotted land, the faint outline of Brest, gray under rain. Shears erupted, weak but real. Some men laughed, others cried. They surfaced fully, engines roaring as they limped toward harbor. The crew gathered on deck, pale ghosts against the wind. As they passed the breakwater, sailors from the docks cheered. U-96 had returned. Out of 30 men, 29 still breathed. Lehman Willenbrock stood at the bridge, cap under his arm, face expressionless. Only his eyes betrayed exhaustion beyond words. When they docked, medics rushed aboard. The crew filed out silently, blinking at the daylight. Reporters snapped photographs, officers saluted. Someone asked how it felt to be heroes. No one answered. Inside the now empty boat, the bread still hung from its pipe, swinging gently in the draft of the open hatch. A fly buzzed around it lazily, landing on the black crust. No one came back to take it down. When U-96 left Brest again in late November 1941, the faces of the men were no longer faces but masks of gray wax, hollow-eyed and sleepless, ghosts that had already learned the taste of the grave they sailed within. And as the submarine slipped beneath the Atlantic once more, it felt as though it were not descending through water, but through memory itself, the familiar moan of the hull greeting them like an old enemy. The commander, Lehman Willenbrock, smoked silently at the periscope, his hand trembling only when the match flared, while Metz, now hardened into something neither boy nor man, moved through the passageways where mildew had become wallpaper, and every breath carried the taste of battery acid. Above them, the winter storms hammered the surface, driving convoys apart. And BDU's orders were simple: cut the arteries of Britain, sink everything. But what none of the brass could hear from their dry desks in Kiel was the way the sea spoke back, whispering through the metal, whispering in voices that sounded like the men they'd already lost. And by the third week out, those whispers had grown so loud that the crew began answering them in their sleep. Richter swore he heard Otto Weiss calling from the bilge, begging for bread, and Kappel the cook claimed that when he opened the pantry one night, the black loaf hanging from the pipe was swinging violently, though the boat was still, and from its mold-crusted crust came a steady dripping like heartbeats. They lived now by ritual: touch the pipe before sleep, spit twice before loading a torpedo, never mention home. But ritual was only a mask for fear, and fear was the only fuel left. When the first depth charge attack of the new patrol came, it did not matter whether the destroyers above truly knew their position, or whether the crew's collective madness had simply summoned the thunder, for the explosions tore through the hull with biblical wrath, gauges shattering, oil spraying like blood, the world convulsing in flashes of red and black, and through it all Lehman Willenbrock stood unmoving, whispering to the boat itself as though coaxing a wounded animal to breathe. Hold. My girl, hold, until the last blast faded and silence returned, a silence so vast it felt holy. But holiness rotted quickly in the depths, and within days hunger returned. The bread nothing more than fossilized memory. So Metz scraped green mold from the pipe with a knife, boiled it into water and drank it, tasting rust and penance. The others followed, one after another, sharing the pot like communion, until even that gesture lost meaning and the hallucinations began. Faces in the condensation, phantom lights flickering through the pressure hull, songs in English humming through the ballast tanks. Kruger, the radio man, started transmitting nonsense, snatches of lullabies, static prayers, coordinates that led nowhere, until the commander smashed the set with his pistol and ordered silence for 48 hours. Silence came, but it did not save them, because silence only made the mind louder. In that endless dark, men began to confess to the steel, pressing their lips against the bulkheads and whispering secrets they had never told a priest. One admitted to sinking lifeboats, another to stealing bread during the first patrol, another to dreaming each night of the same field in Germany, where his body already lay buried. And Metz, unable to bear the sound of breathing, crawled to the forward torpedo room where he lay beneath the hanging bread, staring up as drops of condensation formed and fell into his eyes like tears from a dead god. By then, even Lehman Willenbrock's iron composure had cracked. His log entries shrank into single sentences: sea heavy, crew exhausted, boat restless, until the handwriting broke into unreadable lines, and the men whispered that the commander was speaking to the sea at night, bargaining with it for safe passage home. When the storm of December 5th hit, the Atlantic rose like a mountain. The U-boat tossed and flung as if it were paper. water forcing its way through vents, the batteries flooding, and Lehman Willenbrock gave the only order left: surface, even if it means death. So they burst through the black water into a world of foam and lightning, waves taller than houses, rain slicing like knives, men screaming on the bridge as they tried to keep the hatch from jamming, and in that chaos the bread finally broke free again, the wire snapping, the loaf spinning through the air before landing in the bilge where it dissolved into the filth, and Metz saw it vanish and felt something in himself vanish too. They survived the storm by miracle, engines coughing like dying lungs until the sea grew tired of killing them, and when morning came the ocean was flat, unnervingly calm, sunlight weak and sterile, and all across the deck lay men too weak to move, eyes glazed like statues pulled from shipwrecks. The commander lit one final cigarette, his hand steady once more, and said to no one in particular, "The sea spares us only to remember us later," then turned toward the horizon where home waited unseen, beyond 1,000 miles of empty gray. That night descending again, the boat smelled of burnt oil and ghost smoke, but also of something almost human. Hope, perhaps, or its opposite. And as the red lights dimmed and the diesels fell silent, Metz closed his eyes and listened to the heartbeat of the hull, steady, relentless, eternal. The sound of the sea breathing through iron lungs, and in that breath he heard all the voices they had left behind. Weiss, the English sailor, the destroyer crews, even the bread itself whispering its final sermon down here. You do not live to fight. You fight to remember that you are still alive. When U-96 limped back through the gray channel of Kiel in early 1942, the sea was so still it looked ashamed, and the men who emerged from her hatches did not look like victors, but survivors of an element that had tried to erase them. Photographers clicked shutters, officers saluted, yet the crew moved as if underwater, hearing only the slow heartbeat of the diesel engine still echoing in their bones, and the smell of oil clung to them like a second skin that no soap could lift, the scent of the depths following them into every doorway of the port. Metz stepped onto the pier first, his boots trembling on solid ground he no longer trusted, and he blinked at daylight that seemed unreal, too bright, too clean, too empty of pressure, the sky a pale wound stitched across the horizon. Behind him Lehman Willenbrock descended last, immaculate in his salt-stained coat, his eyes hollow as if a piece of the Atlantic still lived behind them. And as the band struck a march, the commander only shook his head, murmuring that the sea should never have music. It should only have silence. The men were herded toward medical tents where nurses pressed oxygen masks to faces that could no longer remember how to breathe freely, and one by one they coughed up black water that had never been swallowed. Ghosts purging ghosts while the officers filled reports describing minor damage. Good morale. Though nothing about them was minor and nothing resembled morale. Nights in the barracks were worse than the dives, because in sleep the floor ceased to be solid and the walls sweated again, and the sound of depth charges returned in dreams so loud that men woke screaming, hands over ears certain the roof was collapsing. Metz kept a piece of the broken wire that once held the bread, coiled it in his pocket like a talisman, and when he touched it he could still feel the pulse of the boat, the breath of 30 men who had become one single organism of fear and duty. He walked the streets of Kiel among crowds that cheered U-boat heroes, hearing the word invincible tossed like confetti, and he wondered if invincibility was simply surviving long enough to envy the dead. Weeks later, when the boat was refitted for another patrol, he went aboard to fetch his duffel and found the interior scrubbed clean, the smell of mold replaced by paint, the pipes gleaming sterile under white lights, but the space felt wrong, larger somehow, emptier as though the ghosts had been polished away. Yet above the forward torpedo room, he saw a small dark stain on the steel, a patch that resisted paint, the exact shape of the bread's shadow, and in that stain he saw every heartbeat of the voyage, every whisper through the hull, every face that had stared into the black mirror of the sea and found itself looking back. Outside, dockworkers shouted, gulls wheeled. The wind smelled of diesel and snow, and Lehman Willenbrock appeared beside him, cap tucked beneath his arm, saying quietly, "They'll send her out again, you know. They always send her out again." His voice not bitter but tired, the resignation of a man who had bargained with eternity and received only postponement. Metz nodded, not trusting speech, and as he left the pier he looked once over his shoulder, U-96 resting motionless against the dock, hull patched, periscope raised like a gravestone in morning fog, and for a moment he thought he heard the slow creak of her pressure hull calling to him, the sound of the deep reminding him that nothing which has lived beneath that weight ever truly surfaces. Months later, when news reached him that U-96 had been lost with all hands in the Bay of Biscay, he felt neither shock nor sorrow, only a vast stillness like the calm after a storm. And that night he dreamt of the Atlantic again, black and endless, with a single loaf of bread drifting downward through the cold, swinging from an invisible wire, its crust breaking apart into crumbs that vanished in the current like prayers unspoken. He awoke before dawn, the taste of salt on his lips, knowing that the sea keeps what it loves and that some part of him, some breath, some heartbeat was still down there hanging from pipes, waiting for the next recruit to arrive and listen to the voices that never stop.